Hello and welcome to Talking Tudors, a fortnightly podcast about the ever-fascinating Tudor dynasty. My name is Natalie Grueninger and I'll be your host and guide on this journey through 16th century England. Are you ready to step through the veil of time into the dazzling and dangerous world of the Tudor court? Without further ado, it's time to talk Tudors. Hello everyone, welcome back to another episode of Talking Tudors. I'm your host, Natalie Grueninger. Thank you so much for joining me today. I'd like to begin by thanking the sponsor of today's episode, Sandra Bird, author of the Tudor Ladies in Waiting series. A rich alchemy of fact and fiction, these critically acclaimed books chronicle the glittering court lives of three queens and their closest friends and companions. The novels brim with heartwarming and heartbreaking circumstances and heroines who choose lives worth risking for. Book 1, To Die For, follows Queen Anne Boleyn through the viewpoint of Margaret Wyatt. Library Journal awarded it a Best Book of the Year pick and said the novel brings history to life in exquisite detail. Book 2, The Secret Keeper, uncovers love and betrayal in the life of Queen Catherine Parr. Library Journal calls this book atmospheric, full of twists, and a must-read for Tudor fiction fans. Finally, Book 3, Roses Have Thorns, draws close to Queen Elizabeth I through Ellen von Snakenborg, who transformed into Helena, the Marchioness of Northampton. I loved all three books and found this concluding one masterful, impeccably researched, and deliciously detailed storytelling. The series is available at Amazon.com. I'd also, of course, like to acknowledge and thank the wonderful listeners who continue to support my podcast on Patreon and extend a heartfelt thank you to everyone who's taken the time to rate and review the show. As an independent podcaster, this really does mean a lot to me. If you love the podcast and you never miss an episode, I invite you to join the Talking Tudors patron family. Visit patreon.com/talkingtudors for more information. Join the Talking Tudors patron family, and in addition to receiving lots of Tudor-themed goodies, you'll have access to patron-only monthly giveaways. February's prize is a copy of The Queen's Frog Prince, The Courtship of Elizabeth I and the Duke of Anjou by David Lee. Thank you so much to the author for sponsoring this wonderful prize. You can also support the podcast and share your love of Tudor history with the world by buying Talking Tudors merchandise. There are a number of designs and products available, including phone cases, mugs, notebooks, and apparel. Check out all the products at talkingtudors.threadless.com. I would love to see pics of you wearing or using your Talking Tudors merch, so please do tag me on social media and use the hashtag #ILoveTalkingTudors. Now, on to today's episode. I'm thrilled that joining me on the show to talk about Hever Castle's new exhibition, Catherine and Anne, Queens, Rivals, Mothers, are Dr. Owen Emmerson and Kate McCaffrey. Our conversation's coming up straight after this short musical break, courtesy of guitarist Jon Sayles. everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Talking Tudors. I am so excited to be here today with my wonderful friends, Kate McCaffrey and Dr. Owen Emmerson. And I'm going to get you guys to introduce yourself. So, Kate, would you like to go first?
Yes. Yeah, my name is Kate McCaffrey and I am a historian and one of the assistant curators at Hever Castle in Kent.
Hello, yes. My name is Dr. Owen Emmerson. I'm a social and cultural historian. I'm the castle historian and assistant curator at Hever with Kate. We are partners in crime.
What a team it is. It's the dream team, as I say, that curatorial team. And so we're here to talk about something very exciting, the new exhibition at Hever Castle. So Catherine and Anne, Queen's rivals, mothers. So I'd love to know what actually inspired this particular exhibition.
Yes, so this exhibition was very excitingly inspired by my own personal research with one of our books of hours in our collection. It's our 1527 printed book of hours, which I've spoken to you about before. And part of my MA thesis research, which focused on this book, found that Anne Boleyn was not the only leading 16th century woman to own a copy of this very same printing. And in fact, another of Henry's wives, his first wife and the Queen of England at the time of that book's production, Catherine of Aragon, also owned a copy of the very same book. So we wanted to use this very rare sort of glimpse of a moment of unity between these two traditional rivals to re-examine their relationship and look at what else they shared in common, because really there was a lot more that united them other than just a husband and a prayer book. They had a lot in common. And so we wanted to use this kind of original research as a way to widen our lens and see the other things that Catherine and Anne shared, which really was quite a lot.
So exciting. And I know, so you've got one on loan from the Morgan Library. That's Catherine of Aragon's Book of Hours, and it's together with your beautiful Book of Hours. So this is incredible. I'd love to hear a little bit more about the actual prayer books themselves in terms of similarities, or just a little bit more detail into those would be wonderful.
Yes, so the two printed books, although they're from the same printed batch, so they were both printed in Paris by Germain Hardouin, who was a very prolific French printer at the time, and he printed them in 1527 for use in the year 1528. And what's interesting, although they are the same printing, they are decorated quite obviously differently. So that's why it's fantastic that we have Catherine's on display as well as Anne's, because we've chosen one specific page for them both to be open on the same page so that you can see the decorative differences across the two copies. So we've chosen the nativity scene in both books, and in Anne's copy you can see we have extra gold page borders where Catherine's has no gold page borders. In Anne's there are also added roundel borders with inscriptions in them around the images that Catherine's does not have, and Anne's also has extra red and blue corner decoration added to her book as well. So the illumination are very different, and actually the images themselves are different, although they would have been from the same woodcut. For example, in Anne's copy she's got quite a young Jesus young Joseph, and in Catherine's copy it's quite an old Joseph, and in Catherine's copy they're outside, and in Anne's copy they're inside the stable. So there's all these kinds of decorative differences which are really interesting individual insights, I think, because these books were highly personalized. So whoever gifted these books to Catherine and Anne was aware of their individual intended audience, and so had them customized deliberately at different levels, which is particularly interesting, knowing that at this point, it's a very crucial point in the changing structure of the Henrician court. Anne's star is very much on the rise at this point. She is the confirmed queen to be, and Catherine's star is on the wane. So the fact Anne has the more decorated prayer book is a really interesting insight, I think.
Absolutely. And do you think this is something that Anne would have commissioned herself, or you mentioned that it may have been a gift?
Yes, it's still something that we're researching, but it's possible either that Anne and Catherine heard of these books being produced and added their own individual decoration from the start of production, or that they were gifted by someone to members of the Queen's household, including the Queen herself. There's a couple of theories we're working on, a couple of very attractive but as yet unprovable possibilities, one being that they were gifts from Henry himself, or maybe even by Cardinal Wolsey.
Well, that's an interesting theory. Let's talk a little bit more about the insights that they offer into not only Anne and Catherine's faith, but also their relationship as well.
This is a really, really great question. And I think Kate's research really illuminates that this is almost kind of the last point of unity between Catherine and Anne. After these books are received or purchased by the queen and the future queen to be, they really don't have any more time left that we could consider in any meaningful way unified. I think that this is their last point of unity, and we know that Anne is still in Catherine's household at this point. It must have been slightly troubling at times, and we know that Anne is escaping the heat of court because of the scandal that is erupting in Catherine's household because of Henry's attentions towards her. But these two women undoubtedly would have been together, and most likely with these books as well. So one of the most striking things, I think, for me in Kate's research is that this is their last moment of unity. And one of the things I'm really struck by is actually Kate's brilliant attention to how these books were used by these women. Now, there are English prayers inserted into these books, but they are chiefly written in Latin. And one of the things that really struck me through Kate's close analysis of the books was that it was quite clear that Anne's book had more haptic wear, so where via touch or even by the pressing of lips in some occasions to the English prayers, whereas there was far more evidence of haptic wear for the Latin prayers in Catherine's book, which I think gives us a really interesting insight. We know that Anne champions reading the Bible in the vernacular. We have many examples of that. Also, I was struck that this actually talks also about perhaps a more overlooked aspect of Anne Boleyn's faith, and that is that to our eyes it probably would have looked entirely conventional. And Anne, I think, as a reformer or someone with reformist leanings or an open eye to it, must have had a very good understanding of the traditional approach to faith, shall we say, the typically Catholic approach. So actually, this is an entirely traditional text, isn't it, Kate? So the fact that Anne owned a number of these texts sort of challenges that overly simplified, shall we say, lens that has often been placed on Anne as chiefly a reformist. Actually, she had a really, really good understanding of traditional Catholic belief in order to know how she wanted it to be reformed.
I think that's such an important point just to emphasize there, because I think it's often overlooked in our understanding of Anne's religious beliefs. When I've read books and articles specifically about Anne's religion, often her use of books of hours is not examined or not focused on as much, and I think it's because it actually bucks the trend of what we know of her as this reformist. But it's so prescient what Owen said there, which is that Anne's interest in reform has to come and is rooted in a genuine interest in Christianity in general and in the traditional religion. She has to be deeply knowledgeable about the traditional religion in order to know what she wants to reform. And I think that's something that's often overlooked. And I think her use of several books of hours, we are lucky enough to have 2 at Hever, it's a really important tool for us to remember that actually maybe the pace of her religious development was not as obvious or fast or explicit as we've maybe thought in the past. And the haptic wear that Owen mentioned as well is a really interesting part of the books that I love particularly, that there are these decorative differences, but there are also differences in how these 2 women used and loved their books. And it's fabulous that you can see the literal remnants of that on the pages today. You can see the marks left behind from the grease and oils on their fingertips, and where they've folded pages down and the parchment's creased from reading, or the text has been rubbed while they've been reading. It's just, they're some of my most favorite intimate insights, I think.
That is utterly fascinating. That really is, to think of them using the books in that way. And I think people are always really interested in how much time. People have often asked me this, and it's a tricky one to answer, but maybe one of you would like to talk about this. How much time someone like Anne Boleyn or Catherine of Aragon would have spent in religious acts. So, my understanding is that it's a very large part of the day, and it's sort of the backbone to everything else that you do. But perhaps you want to talk a little bit about the different ways that they are expressing their faith at this point.
Yeah, books of hours in their title are books that were meant to be read and prayed with at certain hours of the day, at the 8 canonical hours throughout the day that were based on the kind of religious life of monasteries. And books of hours were made to be more accessible versions of that religious routine for everyday people, or everyday people who could afford a book of hours, which was not your average person. So I think it's really hard for us to grasp. Like you said, it's really crucial that we try and understand how much religion governed their everyday life, whether that was more in a traditional vein like Catherine or a more reformist one like Anne. Their whole daily routine from waking to going to bed was governed in some way by the routine of praying, of chanting, of going to chapel, of group religious activities together. I think is really key when we're looking at women in history, and particularly women at court at this time. It was an appropriate way for women to spend hours in their day by group prayer, group reading of these books, which is perhaps when Anne and Catherine last used these books, was perhaps in a group together reading in court. I think what's important with women specifically is remembering their differing levels of literacy and fluency in Latin. It's really hard to say, exactly how much most women were able to read. We know that Anne and Catherine were highly educated, but obviously that was unusual. So group reading by reading things aloud was a really important part of learning and of religious engagement for women. So yeah, I don't think we can understate how much their everyday lives were governed by religion, and how much that was just an obvious part of their daily routine. They wouldn't have even noticed it because that's how they would have been brought up.
And I'm so glad. I recently saw the Guardian article that was written about the exhibition, and I was so happy to see that it focused on Anne's genuine piety rather than other aspects that are perhaps more popularized. I was very happy with that. But the other thing I wanted to talk, maybe Owen, you'd like to tell us a little bit about, we often pit these women against each other, and I know Kate and I have spoken about that before, but what similarities are there between Catherine and Anne that perhaps we haven't focused on sufficiently up until this point?
I think there are a huge amount of similarities between these two women. They may not have agreed on the reformist leanings that Anne entertained, but my goodness, could they talk faith together? They both had a very deep and very meaningful relationship with God, and I think both were incredibly pious women. Piety and Anne Boleyn aren't, as you say, particularly synonymous, and they should be, because I think all of Anne's decisions, all of her, I don't even want to call it game playing. I believe that Anne Boleyn's relationship with Henry VIII was sort of shaped by her faith. Actually, we're often encouraged to believe, for example, that her not putting out was some kind of game. Actually, I think it's far more to do with her faith and the fact that she didn't want to have sex before marriage. So yes, I think we often deny Anne a genuine religious experience, whereas we almost burden Catherine with only looking at her as someone who is pious and sad, and there was far more to Catherine of Aragon than that. So they're often on a pendulum, I think, and the reality is somewhere much closer in the middle. And because of that distance that we put between these two women, we often fail to see their similarities. And they were both devout, they were both highly educated women. I have a feeling both of them were far more intelligent than Henry VIII.
I can guarantee that, Owen.
I think that could be an issue at times. I really do. They were both incredibly cultured. These are women who, for example, are leading, I would say, leading lights in terms of the arts, in engendering serious patronage of artists and musicians. These are Renaissance women. Henry is, famed for trying to be this Renaissance king. He had two queens, his first two queens at least, were incredibly cultured women. So I think they had a huge amount in common. And we often overlook those crucial years between 1522 and the moment, whenever it was, that Henry first turned his attentions to Anne. And because there's this paucity of information about their relationship, it's very easy to overlook it. But the fact that Anne remains in Catherine's service during this time must suggest that they had something of a congenial relationship, at least. It would have been very easy to part ways with Anne's employment because she was in Catherine's employ if they didn't get on. So we often overlook that, and I think that is because we are so encouraged to pit these women against each other. We are encouraged to see Catherine as the true queen and Anne as the usurper, the whore, the woman who took the king away from his first wife. And we often allow Henry to be sort of abdicate all responsibility for what actually happened to these women as well. So I'm hoping that because of the presence of these two gorgeous books that Kate has so amazingly been able to reunite in the Boleyn's Great Chamber at Hever, our visitors will have an opportunity to apply a different lens to these women and actually give them both the fair hearing that they deserve. These are amazing, amazing women, and we have a lot of time for them at Hever.
That's such wonderful points. I totally agree with you. I think we often underestimate the impact that Queen Catherine had on a developing Anne Boleyn. We talk about Margaret of Austria, we talk about Queen Claude, and rightfully so. But I think all those years, Catherine was a very successful queen, and Anne was a very observant person, as we know. So she would have been observing. And I know people often like to wonder whether Anne emulated Catherine. I think completely. And these books offer just one little piece of evidence to support that, but there's so much more, isn't there? But I also wanted to ask you, I know that we've got the wonderful books of hours, but I know there are some other wonderful things to see at this exhibition. So what else can visitors expect to see there?
We have a wonderful array, actually, of items on display, not just the two books of hours of the two queens. We have a beautiful and never before exhibited panel portrait of Catherine of Aragon, which was very kindly lent to us by the Fawcett family, who got in touch with Owen, actually, after they saw the unveiling of our once Catherine Parr, now Catherine of Aragon portrait, which we renamed last year. They saw that on the television and thought, she looks awfully similar to a portrait that we have of this woman. Could this be Catherine of Aragon? And she certainly is. And so it's fantastic that we've been able to loan her, again, never before exhibited. And she's placed in the Great Chamber overlooking her own Book of Hours. So it's a really beautiful place to have her centered. We also have some beautiful miniatures of the key players, including a 16th century miniature of Catherine of Aragon, loaned to us by Dr. Elizabeth Norton, which is just beautiful to have on display. And we have a panel from Dunstable Priory with Catherine of Aragon's arms on it. So it's the Tudor rose combined with her pomegranate. And then we also finish our exhibition with some outstandingly made costumes from two of my favourite period dramas, actually. One being the recent Stars production of Becoming Elizabeth, with the costumes in that I thought were absolutely fantastic. And we have on display one worn by Catherine Parr, one by Edward, one by Mary, and one by Elizabeth. So we kind of translate the theme of Catherine and Anne in the first half of our exhibit through to the relationship between their daughters in the second half. And that obviously is another huge moment of unity between Catherine and Anne. Maybe their biggest moment of unity is the fact that they were both mothers to not the longed for male heir, but in fact to two daughters who became England's first two queens regnant, and whose legacies have long outlived that of Edward, of Henry's eventual son. So we wanted to examine Catherine and Anne's roles as mothers and map their tumultuous relationship onto the relationship of their daughters. And so we do that with the help of these gorgeous costumes from Becoming Elizabeth, but also possibly my favourite costume, which is the coronation gown worn by Kate Blanchett in the Elizabeth films from the early 2000s. And we have the full gown with all of her regalia. So we have the crown, the orb and the sceptre. And putting that dress together was an absolute highlight for me of the installation of the exhibition. We were just giddy unwrapping it and dressing her. She is, I mean, what a tiny waist, but my word, I would love to be putting that on myself. We may or may not have been tempted to try on the crown, but it's just the most outstanding piece of art. And actually it's very historically accurate the way that it's been made. So there's about 5 or 6 layers underneath what you see on display. And it's all very heavy and heavily embroidered, and it's just beautiful. So to have that, because that is a faithful replica of the coronation portrait of Elizabeth, and would have been the robes that Mary wore as the first Queen of England, Queen Regnant of England before Elizabeth. So it's a nice moment of unity again to end the exhibition on when we're looking at the books of hours as a lens of unity between Catherine and Anne. We're finally ending the exhibition with the coronation gown as a moment of unity between Mary and Elizabeth. So we really have I think, though we say so ourselves, a wonderful array of items on display this year to hopefully capture the attention of people who are coming into the exhibit from all backgrounds and all sort of levels of knowledge.
I think I saw some videos that Owen posted having some fun with those costumes. It looked wonderful. And I love how it's sort of like a full circle when you're talking about that unity. It's how you begin and end there. So that's really wonderful. And the panel portrait, has that been dated at all?
No. So part of the loan agreement from the very generous Fawcett family was that I would conduct some research into the painting during its loan period with us. And I think we're getting quite close to finding what kind of pattern that it came from. I found another example of a portrait just very similar to it. And I have a sneaking suspicion that it may be older than the Fawcett's originally thought. So over the next year, while we have it in our possession, aren't we so lucky to have it? We will be conducting more research into it. So watch this space. Exciting. I love it. And there are pictures online if anyone wants to go and have a look. I think, Owen, you posted one, or Kate, or probably both of you posted one on social media. So what are you ultimately hoping that visitors will take away from this experience, this exhibition?
I think we're hoping that visitors will be thinking afresh about what we know about Catherine and Anne. We hope that people will be joining us in reappraising their relationship, in challenging the traditional narratives that have pitted them against one another, in also challenging the patriarchal stereotypes which have painted them rather one-dimensionally as the mistress and the wife, and that's about it. So we really hope that we are tapping into this kind of, I think, very current movement, which is re-examining the wives of Henry VIII as individuals outside of his influence, and of admiring and appreciating both women for being, as Owen's mentioned, incredibly intelligent, brilliantly formidable, highly educated, pious, captivating women. I think it comes back again to that Henry probably had a type, and both of these women fit those kind of characteristics of these strong women. And so I think what we hope people leave with is just a sense of challenging the traditional stereotypical narratives and rethinking what we know through this lens of this new original research.
Do you want to add anything, Owen?
Yeah, I really hope that our visitors can learn something new, feel a bit challenged. I also hope they can start to feel Hever in a new way. We've set up for example, the best bedchamber with a gorgeous bed from 1485, which used to be on the other side of the castle, but which we've now put in situ. And it's very much the kind of bed that would have been enjoyed by Thomas and Elizabeth in that space. And indeed, during the time that we're talking about in, the 1520s, the late 1520s, Anne Boleyn herself would have occupied that best bedchamber when she set up her own little mini court, shall we say, at Hever. And I'm hoping that people will start to feel what it actually would have been like. So, for example, that room is set up really to acknowledge the fact that Anne was there when she had the sweating sickness. So you should hear the crackle of the fire in that space. You should be able to smell some of the medicines that Dr. Butts would have been applying to her, and actually grind some of them up yourself as well. And he also narrated some of the love letters that Henry was bombarding Anne with at that time. And the other thing that I really hope that people get out of the exhibition is a sense of how privileged these people were, because the gowns that we have been able to get, as Kate said, are absolutely sumptuous. They are really accurate and detailed sort of reconstructions, really, of gowns as they appeared in paintings. And I really want people to sort of understand that the women that we're talking about were in a very privileged minority. There were very few people who could afford to wear these sumptuous cloths and were adorned with these ridiculous amounts of jewels. And actually, I'm hoping they find it quite fun, actually, to see these kind of really faithful representations of the kind of clothes that these women were wearing, because they're beautiful. They're absolutely stunning. So I hope there's a bit of glitz and glam for people to explore as well.
I love it. And I love that you're engaging all the senses in that experience. I think that's so very important. And you're so right. This is not just your average knight's daughter, is it, Owen, that we often hear about. This is a very wealthy family. So that is absolutely fantastic. I want to now move the conversation a little bit to the recent research that Dr. Simon Thurley recently undertook at the castle, because I haven't spoken to you about that just yet. I'd love to hear about this new information that's recently come to light about the history of the castle.
Yes, so Professor Simon Thurley did come to Hever Castle a good few years ago now. It was actually before I joined in this capacity. And he did a really wonderfully in-depth architectural survey of the castle, and has, through his research, given us a lot to think about and to use in representing the castle over the next few years, which is going to be a huge project and very exciting project moving forward. But he's both given us completely new things that we never considered before or never realized before, but also confirmed potential theories that we had about the castle's history. A few big ones spring to my mind, and that is the date of the original castle itself, which he has given us to 1383 as opposed to 100 years before. And this means, however, that the defensive features in our gatehouse, which are all largely original, which is fantastic, he believes to be some of the oldest working defensive features, such as the portcullises in Europe, which is just an incredible claim for us to use and to celebrate. So he's really fleshed out the medieval part of Hever's history, but he's also given us depth to what we know about Hever now during the Boleyn's period, our most famous owners, but also brought to the forefront, I think this is Owen and I's personal favourite part of his research, another wife of Henry VIII and another Anne of Cleves, and the importance of her tenure at Hever, which lasted for 17 years. And he's shown us that 3 key additions to the castle that you still see and walk through and love today as a visitor were made during Anne of Cleves's tenure. So we know that she made some huge alterations to the castle, which is just so exciting for what we know about our history in the 16th century, and the fact that we can now, very credibly claim to be the home of two of Henry VIII's wives, his two Annes, our Anne Boleyn and our Anne of Cleves. And I think that's something that we really want to hero going forward, is bringing Anne of Cleves's story to the forefront. The three areas of the castle that we know that she added are the entrance hall on our ground floor, our staircase gallery on our middle floor, and our gorgeous long gallery on our top floor. And I think the long gallery is probably one of the most popular rooms in the castle by the visitors. And so the fact that we now know that this was likely added by Anne of Cleves during her tenure is just such an interesting new perspective on what we know about Hever. We now know that she loved and used Hever a lot more frequently than we might have thought once. Clearly, if she's making these major additions to the space, she was obviously invested personally and financially into our little castle in Kent. So it's exciting news for us, and we're really thrilled to have this much more information to use going forward.
It's difficult, though, although it's very exciting to kind of, draw out those long-standing beliefs that you had about and ideas about people and places, and challenge yourself to open up to these new ideas, because I've always loved imagining the Boleyn children running in that gallery. So that's kind of ruined that for me. Now I'll have to picture them somewhere else in the Great Hall or somewhere. But do you find that it is tricky to kind of challenge yourself and open up to all these new ideas and this new way of thinking about a place that you are both so very familiar with?
Yeah, it is a challenge, not least because we got a massive team of people who've worked at Hever for a good many number of years, and they've been used to telling a very particular version of Hever's history. And wonderfully, they are all so excited about this new reappraisal of our history, and very enthused by it indeed. So very much coming on the journey with us. But yes, of course, we have the preconceived ideas. These are, long established ideas as well. I mean, Joseph Nash famously painted, Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn in the Long Gallery. And, we have a wonderful diary from Queen Victoria saying, I sat in Henry VIII's chair in the Long Gallery. She didn't, sadly, because we have no evidence that he ever actually visited Hever, although he certainly owned it right throughout Anne of Cleves's tenure. So yes, the most sort of excruciating thing for me was being sent novels by people who were writing about Hever, saying, have I got everything right? And I wasn't allowed to say anything because this research hadn't been released. So there were a fair few scenes set with Henry and Anne in the Long Gallery during this period, which might need to be revised in the second editions. But honestly, though, I think the thing about history is our understanding of it changes all the time. And actually, for some years now, we have been skeptical about the claim about the Long Gallery and it being one of the earliest in England, not least because other academics have questioned it too. I'm thinking of Rosalind Coope, who questioned it in the 1980s. So yes, this has been on our radar for some time, but we just wanted the kind of proof that we now have, wonderfully. And I am so excited about actually bringing Anne of Cleves' story to the fore at Hever. When I started, the opinion was very much that she probably didn't stay there very much. Ian, one of our stewards, very famously used to say to me, well, we know that she was here for one day because we have one letter that she sent to Mary, signed from Hever. But actually now we have a collection of many other letters that were sent to Anne at Hever and that she sent from Hever over quite a long period of time. And those additions to Hever really tell us of a substantial investment in and residing in Hever during that tenure as well. So very, very exciting to be able to tell that story in the coming years.
It really is really exciting. And that's a long 17 years. That's a long time. That's probably not something that people realize. And I think you're right. If she's investing all this time and money, a lot of money, if we're talking about those three significant changes to the castle, to me that suggests a fondness for it, obviously. There must just be something so special about Hever, really, because if you think about it, the Boleyns had so many other wonderful properties, much larger properties, and of course Anne of Cleves had other properties, but there's something that draws people to Hever, and I think that's very, very special. And I also think now with the Long Gallery and those other spaces, how nice is it to be able now to walk in the footsteps of Anne of Cleves? I know that she was there in quite a cozy space, so we can really inhabit that space with us. So I think that is really, really exciting.
I was just going to say, yes, that's exactly a really important point, I think, Natalie, where this new research seems to have almost taken slightly with one hand the myths that we once loved that were associated with Hever. It's totally given with the other hand a whole new breadth of detail that we didn't realise before, and insights into new historical characters who we know and love, like Anne of Cleves, but also it's fleshed out what we know, for example, about the Boleyns at Hever. So when you may have once wanted to picture them running around the Long Gallery, we can now really firmly situate them in other areas of the castle. So the Boleyns family apartments, which are on currently where our exhibition is, where our Books of Hours room is, and the bedchamber, the best bedchamber that Owen mentioned earlier that we've just reset as a bedchamber. Those three rooms on that wing of the castle were the Boleyn family apartments through and through. And we know that some of the most life-changing conversations for Anne happened in those rooms. It's likely where she replied to the love letters from Henry VIII. It's likely where she made the decision to marry him over Christmas in 1526 at Hever. You can only imagine the kinds of conversations that were had in those rooms, private ones, but that had huge public consequences for the Boleyns, for England, for Europe. So whereas in some ways the myths have changed, it's just so exciting, I think, to now know with more accuracy that these rooms, particularly the Boleyn family apartments, I know Owen and I are really excited about these when we represent these. They are just hugely important, hugely impressive, and at the very heart of Hever, and at the very heart of the politics and religion of the time and everything that was happening in England at that moment. So it's really exciting in that way, I think.
Yes, no, I quite agree. And I think it highlights, we've always had this question, how much did the Boleyns actually use Hever? Well, it turns out a huge amount. How much did Anne of Cleves actually use Hever? Much more than we thought. And actually, I think we all should really understand why, because we all love it. I mean, Hever almost hasn't changed. That's one of the key things that's come out of Simon's research. The original house is still in situ. There was always this fear that it had been reconstructed over time, or even that the Boleyns had inserted a house into earlier walls. Actually, it all pretty much dates from 1383, apart from that part that Anne of Cleves added. And because it was tenanted out for so much of its history afterwards, it sort of became this Sleeping Beauty castle, which really hasn't changed all that much at all. And you know what? It was just a convenient and very beautiful place to be situated. It was very close to London. It was, a half a day's ride. So it was a convenient place to be able to escape the pressures and heat of court. And it was also very manageable. I mean, these are wealthy people. They don't need to worry about the running of a household. But I'm talking more about privacy here, because actually this really is only a family property. You can't really entertain a huge amount of guests here. And of course, the Boleyns have many other properties which they can do that in. But time and time again, they gravitate back to that little castle where they can be private, where they can go out hunting, where they can perhaps discuss things they don't want other people overhearing. So it really suits them well. It suited Anne of Cleves well too. Or rather, she adapted it to make her suit her. I have a feeling that Anne of Cleves really starts to use Hever when the palaces of Bletchingley and Richmond are taken away from her. And of course, Richmond was famed for its long galleries. So of course, Anne, after that beautiful palace has been taken away from her by Edward's council, is going to want a long gallery at her perhaps more modest manor in Kent. So all of this history really helps us to make sense of why these people loved it. And actually, I think it's for many of the same reasons that we all love it too.
Absolutely. I totally agree with you. It's just not overwhelming like some of the other locations. It's so beautiful. It is like a fairy tale castle that you imagine when you're a child, and you draw those castles. Can you give us a little bit of a hint to start wrapping this up about this new research? What developments will take place over the next few years? What can visitors expect?
Well, over the next 3 or so years, we will be representing and recurating the whole castle, floor by floor, using this new wonderful research. And actually, the first stage of that will be finished by the end of March this year. So it's a very quick process. This first stage, we are representing the ground floor first. We're going to be going up floor by floor. So our ground floor will be represented as the Astor experience. This is the floor where you can see most of William Waldorf and his family's additions and modifications to the castle. So we have this fabulous room, which is very popular today, the drawing room, which was represented by Astor 100 years ago, and it was once the larder in the Tudor era. But this room we will be turning back into a 1920s experience. We're honing in on some exciting research actually recently completed by Gareth Russell in his book on the Queen Mother, and we're honing in on an occasion that happens at Hever Castle, and we're sort of using that as an excuse to represent the room as this 1920s drinks and cocktails experience. So the ground floor will be about the Astor experience. It's really crucial that we don't lose them in the story of Hever, although we're all sort of drawn in by the Boleyns and the Tudors. It's thanks to the Astors that we have the castle in any way, shape or form today, really, anyway. They saved us 100 years ago. So we want that to be on the ground floor, but not losing the original usage of the rooms and the usage of the rooms in the Boleyns' time. Upstairs on the middle floor will be the Boleyn experience. That's where we will be transforming the family apartments as much as possible back to how they would have looked in the Boleyn time. So I think that's particularly what Owen and I are really excited about, and that will be launching next year. So we really want to make it as faithful as possible. We get one opportunity to do this, and we're really dedicated to doing it in the most accurate and engaging way possible. We'll be using things like Owen's mentioned that we currently have in the exhibition, more immersive experiences. We want to have soundscapes and smells, ideally things like rush matting. We want it to be as faithful and immersive as possible. And then on the top floor in Anne of Cleves's own long gallery, we will be looking at her story. And then as we go through to the gatehouse, it will be looking at the medieval history. So we're almost going back in time as you go up the castle, but using each space as much as possible as it would have been used in those kind of 3 key eras of Hever's history. So it's a really exciting time to be busy here.
It is so exciting. I'm so excited to head over next month and see you both again and to see the castle. But now it seems I have to come back next year as well. So thank you for giving me excuses.
You do.
Sorry.
So thank you so much. As always, it's been an absolute joy to speak to the two of you. And I know that our listeners are going to enjoy hearing all about your exhibition. And of course, if you can get to Hever Castle to see the exhibition, it's on until November, is it?
The 10th of November, although Catherine of Aragon's book is only with us until June, and then we're exchanging her book with another very exciting book. More will be revealed soon.
Okay.
Oh, yes.
Still exciting things. That's fantastic. So if you can get to the exhibition, please do. There's also an exhibition book that accompanies that, and people can buy it from the Hever Castle shop. And I know they ship worldwide. So that's maybe a good thing if you're overseas and you're not able to visit the exhibition in person. I think that would be a nice thing to do. Buy yourself the exhibition book, co-authored, of course, by Owen and Kate and Alison as well. Is that right?
Yes. Yeah. Our head curator, Alison Palmer, wrote this one with us. So
excellent. So thank you again for coming on and talking Tudors with me.
You are so welcome. It's absolutely lovely to be back.
It's always a pleasure.
Well, that brings us to the end of this episode of Talking Tudors. Thank you so much for joining us. I absolutely love to hear from listeners, so if you have any comments or suggestions, or just want to say hi, please get in touch with me via my website, www.onthetudortrail.com, where you'll also find show notes for today's episode. If you've enjoyed the show, please share the podcast with friends and family, and don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review. I also invite you to join our Talking Tudors podcast group on Facebook, where you can interact with other Tudor history lovers and hear all all the behind-the-scenes news. You'll also find me on Twitter. My handle is On the Tudor Trail, and on Instagram as The Most Happy 78. It's time now for us to re-enter the modern world. As always, I look forward to talking Tudors with you again very soon.